Hello and welcome to Policy Watch, your packed snapshot of the week's biggest business stories, their context, their relevance and impact. I am Govindraj Ethiraj. The Bombay High Court has ruled in favour of the Indian arm of Royal Dutch Shell, the energy giant, in a multi-million-dollar tax dispute. Shell had challenged this claim relating to transfer pricing, which the Income Tax Department had alleged Shell underpriced shares transferred to the parent by about 15,000 crore rupees. There have been several high-value tax claims on foreign firms, including IBM Corp and Nokia in the past year, sparking criticism that tax authorities could undermine foreign investment in India. Well, now joining me to discuss this are Shailesh, Haribhakti, Group Chairman, DH Consultants Private Limited, and Girish, Vanvari, Co-Head of Tax at KPMG. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. So there are many cases which seem to have gone in favor of some of the multinationals who've been fighting them in India. Most of them seem to be obviously in tax and within tax transfer pricing. But before we come to that, Shailesh, is there a directional feeling that you're getting in all of this?
I'm getting three feelings. I think the government is looking to a way to sort out and settle this whole bugbear of retrospective tax being a deterrent to FDI. We have heard so much on this issue in recent times. Even this particular case of Shell, Arun Jaitley is very carefully considering whether he should go to the Supreme Court at all or
not. And because that's still pending. I mean, the government could technically appeal against the High Court.
That's the first thing we are seeing, that there is a desire to settle this. Second, the litigation on transfer pricing is one of the highest anywhere in the world because it's a new practice in India. And there are not too many precedents, not too many reported cases. And therefore, this is a new law, evolving law. And therefore, we would also like to see somewhere an anchor dropping so that can then be the basis on which other cases will be put together.
Okay.
And the third is that the complexity of this area, because of domestic and international transfer pricing, cap gains, retrospective and all of that is so huge that there is a need for this disentanglement and a clarity of what is the intent of the legislature.
Okay. Girish, are you getting a sense of disentanglement in this, the way things have started off, or is it still a one swallow does not make a summer?
Actually, it's a much welcome relief. If you really see international investors, they get a reassurance that the law of the land works. The Shell decision, the Vodafone decision reassures that, logic will prevail, law of the land works. But really everybody is waiting and watching as to what will the government do. Like Mr. Jaitley, as Mr. Haribhakti said, that, Mr. Jaitley is consulting his attorney general to see what the next course of action should be. If the government really wants to assure an era of a stable tax regime, by not appealing against this would be a very positive signal to the whole international community. Coming to the transfer pricing cases, this is a trend across the world. I mean, you're seeing these big cases across Europe. This e-trade and the e-commerce thing has changed the whole world. And if you look at the base erosion and profit shifting studies and the G20 and OECD, BEPS, that's the trend across the world. So India is no unique to that. And India is even more a difficult jurisdiction because people are starting up your transfer pricing.
And really that's really the question, because is the transfer pricing, are the transfer pricing cases somewhat distinctive and therefore should not be confused to interpret that we are generally being lenient towards all tax issues?
Actually, the transfer pricing cases are not distinctive. Some of them are stretched, like this decision
so
of
15,000 crore and
yes.
transfer of shares.
But otherwise, everywhere the cry is on substance over form. So, what is the real substance and what is the form of the transaction? And that's the way the world is emerging. So, the other transfer pricing litigation is more on the substance over form stuff. There are these way out ones like Shell and Vodafone, but overall, I think the litigation which we are seeing is prevailing across the world, where countries are trying to see how to maximize their shares of taxes.
Right. So, can one or can one not draw parallels with the Vodafone case, Shailesh?
Oh, very much. I think there is a clear parallel between the two cases. And if this decision is accepted, and if we see it in the context of the announcement in the last budget or the provision of the last budget, that the reference for anything that is even halfway retrospective will be to a very high level panel, put together will create that ability on the part of the foreign investors to think that there is a stable regimen governing this area. And I think it will be very positive if we are able to see this settle in a way that the High Court has very logically come to the conclusion that it is a case which must be ruled in favor of Shell and Vodafone.
Okay.
And we had that affirmed at the Supreme Court, and then we had the retrospective.
Right. So you're also seeing a sort of a convergence between executive and judiciary on this?
I think so.
Okay.
I think there is a clear convergence. And my hope and wish and prayer is that we see the back of this one.
Okay. So, Girish, if we were to now look at the larger investing tax environment in India, now what we are doing here is really correcting something that has already happened. We have got still miles to go. What are the key issues there?
Actually, 3-4 of them. Now, the biggest issue everybody is looking at is what will happen to general anti-avoidance rules. And they actually come into force on April 1, 2015. Will the budget defer it, or will it be implemented with some safeguards? There are safeguards in the rule, but is it good enough, and how will it be interpreted? So that's the biggest concern of the international community, especially for investments out of Mauritius, Singapore, and other tax-friendly jurisdictions. The second thing is what's really going to happen to this retrospective amendment. Though it impacts a few companies, but that will be the single biggest directional, attraction to international investors. That law will prevail.
Okay.
So a single step like retrospective amendment going away and all these litigations stopping will restore complete confidence.
Okay. So, Shailesh bhai, are foreign companies and Indian companies equally affected by these little changes or uncertainties in tax, or is it only foreign companies?
The fact is as follows. The strongest part of the tax department today is in the transfer pricing department. So the best talent, best trained, internationally they've been moving around, they've been exposed and all of that, is in the transfer pricing, because it's the largest area, both in the domestic area and in the international transfer pricing area, where the claims can be large, the tax impacts can be large, and therefore full attention is being focused on that.
Okay.
As I said, it's an evolving thing. So we don't have too much of final firm. We have very good global practices that we can draw on. And we know that Germany and Netherlands are some of the most advanced jurisdictions for transfer pricing, getting clear. We need to learn from there. We need to evolve our own practice, and we need to come to some stability. And I see that that will emerge when these litigations finally conclude.
Right. So, you talked about GAR as being one, and of course the whole retrospective. So, this is still in some ways aimed cross-border. What about the tax environment in India itself? I mean, just to kind of, sum that up.
Actually, everything is coupled. So, yes, you can say retrospective amendment only impacts foreigners, but really the world is coupled. I mean, when the Indian people want to raise money, they want to do strategic tie-ups, they want to raise private equity, these negative perceptions don't help. So in a sense, they get impacted. GAR is applicable to everybody. Now transfer pricing is beginning, but domestic transfer pricing litigations will also start, and they should be no different from what is happening with the international transfer pricing. So actually everything is coupled. So what happens in transfer pricing will impact Indian companies also eventually, and indirectly retrospective amendment is impacting the investor sentiments in this country.
Okay. And no, so my question is larger tax environment challenges in this country. So tax terrorism, when the theme was mentioned, it was not only meant for 3 companies in Europe or whatever. It was obviously the whole environment that we are facing in India.
Absolutely. I'm seeing a distinct move towards better compliance. There's no doubt in my mind that people have got the message that what the government is looking for, the judiciary is looking for, is don't be ultra aggressive. Don't try and do things which are obviously patently unbelievable and unnatural, and comply. And I think that message has been captured by both the international community and the domestic community.
Because industry complains, and perhaps rightfully so in many cases, that the tax authorities are trigger happy and have a propensity for high-pitched.
We have seen extremely unfair propositions being advanced in assessments. And we have seen equally a trend of even the first level, at the tribunal level, huge relief being given to the SSC. So there is a little bit of a balance there. But if that balance can be brought about at the first stage, and through clarity, simplicity, better closure on various open litigations. For example, just bunch all these cases together and have one decision which will apply. That's easily possible today.
Right. So conceptually, Girish, I mean, do you see the tax department having a somewhat uniform approach? You know, obviously you go after some cases because you want to make a benchmark of those. But do you see them, and should they be evolving a more uniform, more, I don't know if lenient is the right word, but more conservative approach to assessment so that everyone feels comfortable and safe?
So I wouldn't say lenient, uniform, conservative. I think the need of the hour here is better compliance and a better friendly relationship with the tax officers, wherein each party is heard and you lead to logical conclusions. But the need of the hour is better compliance, and I agree with what Mr. Haribhakti said, that if you really look at the way this whole environment is emerging, everything is IT enabled. I mean, we all get now notices, your advance tax is due, your returns have to be filed. So if you use technology for better compliances and have a more customer oriented relationships, you will lead to better conclusions. It's not there yet, but I think at least it's moving in the right direction.
Okay, so we started by talking about Shell and Vodafone and all the big cases. Now let's come to the more the smaller companies, the mid-sized companies. Should they, I mean, what is the onus on them if we are to make this whole environment a happier one when it comes to engaging with the taxman?
Actually, at the root, there are only two concepts. You should behave as if every transaction is being done with an independent arm's length person. And it should be done at a price which is fair. These are the only two concepts. And what is the key thing in transfer pricing? It is documentation. It is establishing the fairness. The proposition has to be established. If these two things are captured by the entire assessing and the tax-paying public, then we could have a very different environment.
Okay, Girish, what's your sense? I mean, what are the principles that all sides should adhere to so as to make this a more happy tax compliance?
Better compliance, better documentation, substance over form. I mean, deal with yourself as if you were dealing with others, outsiders. So if you did all those basics right, then you will not go foul. Right. And now with GST coming in, anyway you will get to an automated, electronic, compliance-oriented environment, wherein all transactions will be tracked.
Absolutely.
So I think you can't look at only tax cases.
And I'm glad you're saying it as an inevitability. I mean, GST,
Yes, I mean,
we all believe
it's a matter of when, 16, 17, but it's on the card. I think with GST coming in, you are going to see to a better compliant environment. So this is just a transitionary phase.
Right. So moral of the story in some ways is you may be big or you may be small, but I mean, being compliant and being friendly and is important for both sides. Right?
Be good.
Be good. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Shailesh, Haribhakti and Girish Vanvari for joining us. On the other side, we look at the new Coal Ministry draft rules for e-auctions. Stay with us. You're with Policy Watch. Hello and welcome back to Policy Watch. The Coal Ministry has issued draft coal mine special provision rules for e-auctions of 74 coal blocks. These rules would be placed in the public domain for suggestions till the 24th of this month. This draft comes weeks after the government's ordinance on coal blocks. Here's a report.
New rules and regulations for coal block allocations are expected to be notified by next week. With the Coal Ministry drafting guidelines for allocations, the first phase of auctions could happen as early as February 2015. To ensure transparency, qualified bidders would be asked to put in their financial bids under an electronic auctioning process. The bidding would be open to specified end-use projects in power, steel, iron and cement sectors. In an attempt to avoid monopoly, a cap would be put on the number of blocks a company can bid for.
We are also making an effort to ensure that the blocks are not monopolized by one entity, that they take all the blocks. So the nominated authority will arrive at a particular number. He hasn't arrived as yet, but that work is on.
The biddings will have to be furnished by December 19 and technical process of allotment is expected to be completed by March 3, 2015. Expected aggressive bidding could heighten acquisition costs. The government will take measures to limit the tariff upsurge.
Revenue maximizing approach, it is essential to keep a lid on the tariff. यानी कि जो भी bidding होगी, उसको हम उसमें essentiality रहेगी कि वो उसको pass through ना करें for increasing the tariff.
The Supreme Court had in September cancelled 214 coal blocks allocated since 1993, saying they had been given out in an arbitrary manner. The government moved an ordinance late in October, enabling auctions of some of these blocks. Now, the government proposes to complete the entire process by March 31st, 2015. Kriti Mishra, Rajya Sabha TV.
Well, now to discuss this, we have Rahul Prithiani, Director, CRISIL Research, joining us here in the studio. Rahul, thank you very much for speaking with us. So tell us, we have new draft guidelines. We seem to have a deadline of February 11th and then March to finally announce who the winners for these coal blocks will be. Let me ask the primary question first. We started about going down this road because there was a larger problem of coal and power crisis and so on. Is this moving in that direction of resolving the larger issue?
Thank you, Govind. As clearly, and this will go a long way in terms of determining and bringing in more certainty, transparency in the sector. That clearly is a primary objective. So clearly this is going to help, but we will need to look at the nitty-gritties as to how things really pan out.
Okay, so give me the 2 or 3 key issues which you feel are either hurdles or stuff that has to be sort of reckoned with before we move ahead.
In order to understand how this bidding process will really work, we would need to understand what will be the criteria or the basis on which the reserve price will be decided, what will be the filtering that will happen in terms of the players, in terms of the criteria, in terms of the technical bidding, financial bidding, how will it really pan out, what will be the criteria for assessment of all of that, what are the kind of weightages that will need to be allocated, plus for certain fixed return projects, which can technically bid at even a very high price as they have a pass-through mechanism. So how will it take care that how will the process take care that the tariffs don't increase beyond a
exactly. So
level?
so that's something that the government is already assuring. It's saying that we will ensure that the tariffs will not go up. Now, is that a contradiction? You're saying auction on one end, no tariff hike on the other. How can someone ensure that?
So clearly this is going to be a tricky issue for the government to deal with. So what are the levels that they will decide in terms of the coal pricing? Till what price can the coal be bid out, and at the same time, still attract players? So one would have to figure out what detailing that really comes out.
What do your own studies tell you about what is the optimum level of pricing, if one can say, when it comes to bidding for coal, so as to make it viable for all the downstream work that a company will do, whether it's coal, steel, or so on?
So clearly it varies from sector to sector. So in each sector has its own demand supply dynamics that are at play, and each sector's ability to pay for coal is very different. So clearly that's why the government has identified that, and consequently it's more likely that you'll see power sector being given a separate status versus a steel and a cement plant. So there'll be certain projects which will be allocated for the power sector, while the other projects will go for the rest of the sectors. So demand supply dynamics in each of those sectors will really determine the ability of the player to bid. On the power sector, clearly the key determinants of the winning bidder potentially could be the kind of tariffs that they are enjoying, and also the proximity to the end-use mines, because the logistics cost, as you would be aware, is a very big component in the overall coal cost pricing.
Right. So will this work out is the larger question, right? So if there are auctions, if the companies don't bid aggressively enough in order to outbid each other, or if they bid too low, I mean, the auction can also fail in that sense, isn't it?
So clearly it will depend on how the government structures, how the process is actually, how the process really evolves. So at each stage, what are the kind of checks and balances that are put in place. At the same time, there is a fair bidding that happens. It should be open for everybody. So depending on the details, it will be really clear. So the government has to tread very cautiously, and many of the issues are quite tricky here, and especially with respect to the power sector, because again, the end user sector, the pricing is more or less capped, and the ability of the SEBs to pay higher price for power is not there.
Right. So you're saying, okay, when it comes to steel, things can still, I mean, be kind of in the hands of the steel producer or the steel maker and so on. Okay, so let me take a step back once again. We said that there is a power crisis in this country, and which is why the whole issue of coal got highlighted. And then there was a problem with the way coal blocks were allocated. So one problem seems to have been resolved, that coal allocations will no longer be on a somewhat arbitrary basis and so on. Will India's power crisis get resolved the way things are going?
The effectiveness of the auction will clearly tell us as to how things are really likely to pan out. And going forward with if we start seeing expeditious production or faster clearances and domestic production rising, to that extent, I think the power situation should improve as we move ahead. Our own estimates are the power deficit from about 8% levels a couple of years back is likely to move closer to about 2% or so as we move ahead, because there are a lot of capacities that are coming on stream, and with more clarity in terms of power projects, in terms of the investments, as we move ahead, we are likely to see more investments that might come in, provided we handle this current coal issue properly.
Right. Okay. So let's look at coal capacity quickly, and what's the gap that we're seeing. So as we understand, it's almost 210 million tons a year could be produced by these 74 blocks. Right? Is that enough to fulfill? I mean, the power minister has talked about a 1 billion coal production target. So where do we stand in all this? Is it feasible?
We will again need to see how it really evolves in terms of the expeditious movement. Clearly, our own estimates is over the next year or so, the imports are likely to peak, and post that, with domestic production coming through from Coal India plus many of the other blocks like the Reliance Power Sasan block, plus you also seeing likely to see some production coming from NTPC. So once that starts happening, maybe in a couple of years time, we should have a downward tick in terms of the imports as a proportion of the overall demand, and going forward we should be the coal situation in the country should get better.
Okay, what about coal imports? Now commodity prices are falling, right? I mean, for many commodities, including of course the biggest of them all, which is oil. Does that affect coal, or is it likely to affect coal?
Clearly, globally, coal production also is on an upswing given the kind of pricing environment that you saw over the last 2-3 years. So clearly, we are in a situation where coal prices globally are likely to remain subdued for some time, which in a way is good for the domestic importers. So clearly, the overall commodity price scenario looks fairly benign, as you mentioned.
Okay. Now let me come back to the process of auctions and so on. Now this is also in some ways a benchmark for all kinds of energy related or resource extraction industries, right? Or what do you feel?
Yeah, the dynamics of, say, I will just compare it with the oil and gas sector, potentially is going to be different. The complexities in that space are different. The pricing mechanism is different, and each case will have to be handled separately, because in all these cases, like as in the case of gas, there is no standard global pricing mechanism that we follow, except for oil, where we are seeing actually cane production, which is actually being priced linked to the global indices. You are having, I mean, there is a different pricing mechanism, and the pricing evolution is not fully there as far as the other fuels are concerned.
Right. So last question. So do you feel that with all of this, with this new draft guidelines, with the intentions now out on the table, we are creating a more investment friendly environment for investors from all over?
So yeah, clearly if you have stronger guidelines, you have
assuming there are even still gaps, as you pointed out, in the details and so on, but directionally, how do you feel?
Clearly, if you're having, if you're providing greater and greater clarity with respect to all investment-related issues, you are providing expeditious clearances. So, no, with all that in place, clearly you are going to attract investments, provided we are able to push through what is being promised.
Okay, and just to again round up, what's the one thing that you are watching out to see whether they get it right in this whole process of in this round of auctions?
What we would be watching out is how they are handling the tricky issues with respect to pricing, with respect to fixed return projects. How are they capping capping tariffs, and at the same time, you know, encouraging fair bidding.
Right. Okay. Right, Rahul. That's a good way to sum up, I think. Thank you very much for joining us today. That's all we have time for on this edition of Policy Watch. We'll be back next week, same time. Thanks for watching.